On January 20th, 1999, 28-year-old John Helbel sat at a table in his trailer home in the small town of North Liberty, Iowa, staring down at a gun. But this was not just any gun. This was a classic old revolver from the 1950s that had seen better days, and so John was intent on restoring it to its former glory. So he picked up a gunsmith screwdriver, which is a small screwdriver with a hollow ground tip, and slowly began taking pieces of the revolver apart. Then, once he had done that, he began cleaning the pieces and removing rust that had collected over the years. John knew restoring a gun like this, at least restoring it the right way, would be slow, painstaking work, and that's actually one of the reasons he loved doing it so much. John had a collection of over 40 classic and customized guns, and when he was working on them, it felt like the rest of the world just disappeared. Somebody could be in the room with him, and he'd forget they were even there. That's how focused he'd become on restoration projects. And staying focused had not always been easy for John. Not long after he had graduated high school and enrolled in college, about 10 years earlier, John had gotten involved with drugs, both as a user and also as a dealer. He was frenetic and all over the place, and so drugs had just caused him a lot of problems. He'd had run-ins with the police, and he'd struggled to hold down a job. But over the last couple of years, he'd really tried to make some changes in his life, and that's where restoring and customizing guns came in. It wasn't really about selling them for money. Instead, it was about having an interest in something that he was really good at, and also that helped him stay calm. It was also something he could do entirely by himself, and John loved being on his own, to the point that some people called him a recluse. He had a small circle of friends and family, but he was known to go days at a time without seeing or calling any of them. Back at the table in his trailer, John looked down at the work that he'd already done on this revolver, and he smiled. It would still take him several more hours, maybe even another full day, to get the gun looking as good as new, but he could already see a huge difference. Still, he figured it was time to stop for now. Because he heard his dog, a 3-year-old black and white Siberian Husky mix named Keisha, barking from the front room of the trailer. That meant she wanted food. And as far as John was concerned, whatever Keisha wanted, she got. John stood up, carefully put the pieces of the gun back in its case, and went to the sink to wash his hands. Then he poured some dog food into a bowl on the floor, and Keisha came running, and John crouched down, scratching behind her ears and talking to her like she was his best friend. Because in reality, she was. In fact, everyone who knew John said he treated Keisha like she was his child. She went with him almost everywhere he went when he left the house, and there were long stretches of time when Keisha was actually the only other living thing that John interacted with. As Keisha ate the food in her bowl, John walked over to a small refrigerator and grabbed a slice of cold pizza. He ripped off a small piece of it, and immediately Keisha turned from her bowl, jumped on top of him, and devoured the human food that John always gave her as an extra treat. When Keisha was done eating the pizza, John walked to a small room at the back of his trailer. This is where he kept his gun collection in several different gun boxes. He opened up a polished wooden box, looking for a spot to put his current project when it was done. And as soon as he did, his face just lit up. Because in this box, he saw his prized possession, a Colt 45 Gold Cup semi-automatic pistol. This was a high-end weapon known for its accuracy and very unique design. And John had customized it further with gold screws and gold flourishes, and he was very proud of the work he had done. Other than his dog and his mom, John said this gun was maybe the most important thing to him in the whole world. John closed the gun box, excited he'd be adding a new piece to the collection soon. Later that night, after taking Keisha for a walk, John sat down at his recliner in the cramped front room of the trailer, and Keisha immediately curled up at his feet. John turned on the TV, and it didn't take long before he had drifted off to sleep. And a few minutes later, he was already sleeping so deeply that he didn't hear the sound of footsteps creaking slowly across the trailer floor. On February 23, 1999, so 34 days after John had fallen asleep watching TV, Detective Douglas Vanoy of the Johnson County Sheriff's Department got a call when he was at his desk. Detective Vanoy heard a woman's voice on the other end, and he could tell right away that she was quite upset. Vanoy asked her how he could help, and the woman told him that she was concerned because she hadn't seen or heard from her son, John Helbel, in over a month. This took Detective Vanoy by surprise. He assumed John's mom was calling to file a missing persons report, but People usually did that when they hadn't heard from a loved one in maybe a few days at the most. So we asked John's mom why she had waited so long to call, and she told him that her son liked keeping to himself. And in fact, it really wasn't unusual for him to go, a week, even 2 at a time, without talking to any of his friends or family. But now it had been over a month, and she'd called him several times, and she hadn't heard back. But she told the detective that she actually did not want to file a missing persons report. Instead, she was hoping the police would meet her at John's trailer to basically go check on him and make sure he was okay. She just had sort of a sinking feeling about this and didn't want to go in there alone. I mean, she figured her son was probably fine, but she just wanted to know for sure, and she just wanted some other people there with her. Vinoy said that was fine. Then he got the address of the trailer and told her he would meet her there. After that, Vinoy hung up and headed out to his car with a deputy. And as he began to drive, the detective thought to himself that no matter what John's mom had said about her son very likely being fine, well, if she's asked the police to join her at the trailer to go inside and take a look, that actually indicates that she must be really worried. A few minutes later, Detective Vinoy and the deputy drove through North Liberty's downtown, and it looked like something from another time, like the shops and restaurants lining the main road had been there forever. Vinoy drove a couple more miles past a stretch of farmland and soon arrived at the Holiday Mobile Home Park that had over 200 trailer homes spread out across acres of land. Vinoy headed down a dirt road through the park that had snow piled up on either side, and after a few minutes, he and the deputy arrived at John's trailer. And right away, they saw John's mom, along with a mobile home park employee waiting for them. They also saw a blue van parked on the dirt drive in front of the trailer. The officers stepped outside of the car. Vinoy thought it was cold, but nothing too bad. It was sort of a typical Iowa winter day, with temperatures a bit over 20 degrees Fahrenheit. John's mom introduced herself and told the detective that she and this employee had actually already tried opening the door, but they found it was locked. And also, nobody was responding from the inside. Vinoy told them, okay, stand back so I can break the door down. But John's mom asked him not to do that. If John really was fine, she didn't want to damage his trailer for nothing. At that point, the employee pointed the officers to a window on John's trailer that would be large enough for them to climb through. Vinoy put on his gloves and checked the window, and he found it was locked, but it was pretty flimsy, and so he managed to pull it open without doing any damage and without much trouble. But as soon as the window was open, Vinoy instantly threw his hands up over his nose and mouth to block the horrific smell coming from the inside. He stepped back and caught his breath, and then told John's mom not to come over there. Then, Vinoy and the deputy kind of braced themselves and went forward and climbed in through the window. Once they got inside, the smell got 10 times worse, and they also immediately saw something strange in the front room of the trailer. There, in the recliner, something large had been completely covered by a blanket. Vinoy held his breath and slowly approached the recliner. He reached out and pulled down the blanket, and right away he kind of flinched. Vinoy was an experienced cop, but he'd never seen anything like this. Sitting upright in the chair was the body of a dead man that had already clearly begun to decompose. However, as gruesome as it was, the man did not appear to have any injuries. It sort of looked like he had fallen asleep and just never woken up again. But as Vinoy walked around the recliner and leaned in closer to the body to get a better look, it quickly became clear that this man had not died of natural causes, because Vinoy noticed 2 small bullet wounds. The detective and the deputy left the recliner and made their way through the few other rooms of the trailer. There was a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a small room at the back. But after searching those areas, they didn't really find anything out of the ordinary. The home had not been ransacked, and there was no sign of forced entry or a struggle of any kind. The only thing Vinoy thought was odd was that there were dog bowls for food and water on the kitchen floor, but no dog, dead or alive. Vinoy called into the sheriff's department and arranged for a county forensics team to come out. He said he had no idea how long the victim had been dead for, but based on the smell and the decomposition of the body, he figured it had been at least a few weeks. After that, Vinoy prepared himself for what he considered to be the worst part of his job. He was pretty sure the dead man on the recliner was John Helbel, but now he needed John's mother to ID the body. Minutes later, John's mother stood in the trailer, fighting back tears. She said that was definitely her son in the recliner. She kept her composure, and in a quiet voice, she told Detective Vinoy that she wanted to do whatever she could to help the police. She said outright that John had not always been perfect. He'd struggled with drugs and had run-ins with the law, but he was a good person, and he always tried to help the people he loved. Vinoy told her he would do everything that he could to bring her and her son justice. He also told her that he knew how difficult it was for her to be here in this trailer right now. But he needed to know if there was anything in the trailer that looked sort of out of place to her. And John's mom didn't hesitate. She said John's dog, Keisha, was missing, and that he loved that dog possibly more than anything else in the world. The deputy took notes on Keisha's breed and appearance. Then Detective Vinoy walked with John's mom through the trailer and asked if there was anything else that stood out. John's mom went through the kitchen and into the small back room. And after looking around for a moment, she turned to Vinoy and said something else was off here. Somebody had robbed John of his entire gun collection, which was very valuable. Vinoy asked if there was a chance that John had maybe just sold all of his guns since the last time she had seen him, but John's mom shook her head. She said even if he had sold the collection, there was one gun he would never get rid of, his customized Colt 45 Gold Cup pistol. She told Vinoy that John would sometimes say if anybody wanted that gun, they would have to pry it from his cold, dead hands. Later that day, the county forensics team arrived and began collecting blood samples and fingerprints from the trailer. While that was going on, Detective Vinoy and the deputy searched John's blue van out front, but the only thing they found inside was a dog leash. The detective didn't know if this meant that John had taken Keisha somewhere before he'd gotten killed, or if he simply just kept a leash in his van. Then, Vinoy and the deputy made their way around the mobile home park and began speaking to John's closest neighbors. But none of them remembered hearing gunshots or anything out of the ordinary over the past few weeks, and they all basically said the same thing. John was a nice guy, but he mostly kept to himself. And so at this point, Detective Vinoy didn't really have much to go on to start this investigation in earnest. He basically needed to wait for the forensics report or the autopsy to get something concrete. And so while he waited for those things, he just hoped that Keisha would turn up. On Friday, February 26th, so 3 days after John's body was discovered, Keisha had still not shown up. However, Vinoy did now have a copy of the autopsy and the forensics report. Unfortunately, though, neither of them gave him very much to go on. The autopsy concluded that John had been killed with a .22 caliber pistol, and Vinoy knew that a lot of .22s don't make very much noise, so that could explain why none of the neighbors heard anything. And then because of the level of decomposition of John's body, the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact date of death. But he believed John had been dead for over a month. And beyond the blood samples from John's wounds and small amounts of blood on the recliner, the forensics team had not found much else. So, Vinoy had a crime scene with very little concrete evidence, where the door had been locked, yet there were no signs of struggle or forced entry, and John's beloved dog and his gun collection were missing. All of this led Vinoy to believe that John had likely been killed by someone he was close with, close enough that he would welcome them into his trailer and who would have known about the gun collection. However, everyone the detective had spoken to said John basically didn't have friends. He was a loner. And so at this point, Vinoy knew this was not going to be an easy case. And also, North Liberty, Iowa was a small town with a population of just over 5,000 people. And so a murder in such a small town like that could quickly lead to massive panic in the community, which meant there was going to be a lot of pressure to find a way to solve this difficult case very quickly. But as Vinoy sat there getting more and more frustrated thinking about this case, a deputy rushed over to his desk, and this young officer had a really excited look on his face. He told Detective Vinoy that he was almost positive he had just found John's dog, Keisha. Vinoy didn't waste any time. He got the location of the dog from the deputy, and then he called John's mother and asked her to go meet him at that location. Vinoy headed out to his car and sped across town to a house in a small neighborhood just a few miles from John's trailer. John's mom arrived soon after, and the two of them went to meet with the man who lived in the house. As soon as they stepped inside, an excited black and white Siberian Husky mix rushed over and greeted John's mom. John's mom pet the dog and got tears in her eyes and said yes, this was definitely Keisha. Detective Vinoy asked the man how he had come to find Keisha, and the man told him he actually found Keisha over a month ago. It was after midnight on January 21st. He said he remembered this specific date because the whole thing was just so odd. He said he had come home that night and saw the dog standing in the middle of the street right near his house. The dog didn't have any tags, and the man didn't recognize her from the neighborhood. But what had really stood out to him was that the dog, despite being out in the elements, was totally clean, like immaculately clean. This seemed really weird to Vinoy too. I mean, it was winter in Iowa. The ground was covered in snow, and the dirt roads outside of town, like where he was describing finding her, were soaking wet and muddy. If Keisha had gotten out of her trailer and wandered a few miles to this location, her fur almost certainly would have been a mess. Now, this story to Vinoy did seem sort of far-fetched, but at the same time, he really had no reason to doubt this guy. I mean, he seemed like he was being very truthful and forthcoming about how this dog came to be in his possession, and so for now, Vinoy decided he would just simply believe him, and he would operate on what this guy was saying. Which meant, if this is really how Keisha was found, well then either John's killer, or an accomplice of the killer, must have driven Keisha here and left her right here on the street. Otherwise, how else could she be so clean? When Vinoy got back to the sheriff's station later that day, he called the crime lab and told them they had located Keisha. He also said he thought the dog had been driven from John's trailer and dumped sometime early on January 21st. So he now believed John had most likely been killed, maybe late on the 20th. The forensics officer he spoke to said that the dog being driven somewhere was actually great news, because a dog's nose print is like a human fingerprint. Each one is unique. So if Vinoy could nail down a suspect, a forensics team could search their car to see if there was any trace of Keisha's nose print on the windows or the interior. Now, Detective Vinoy felt like finding Keisha was a huge deal for this case, but it was no good if he couldn't track down any viable suspects. I mean, the first thing he did is he contacted the man who had found Keisha, and they searched his car to see if, maybe there were prints inside of his car that suggested he was lying about how he found Keisha. But no. It was totally clean, the guy was incredibly truthful, basically made himself fully available to the investigation, and so he was quickly ruled out. And beyond him, there was nobody in the neighborhood where Keisha had been found that had seen anybody drop her off or had any recollection of seeing a car that looked out of place. It was like nobody knew anything. Keisha had just suddenly appeared. So, Vinoy decided to reach out again to everybody he'd already spoken to, John's mom and his neighbors. Vinoy believed that even if John was a recluse, somebody had to know at least one friend of his. And this time, one of John's neighbors did remember something important. The man told Vinoy that he had seen a truck at John's trailer over a month earlier, right around the last time he had seen John. The man was sure that that truck belonged to one of John's few friends, a guy in his 20s named Mike Harding. And after a quick search through police criminal records, Detective Vinoy discovered that, just like John, Mike had a history of using and selling drugs. At the end of February, so a few days after police had found John's dog Keisha, Detective Vinoy sat down with Mike Harding in a small interview room at the sheriff's station. Going into this, Vinoy had no idea what to expect. He knew that Mike had at one point gotten mixed up with drugs and had some trouble with the law in the past, but it really wasn't anything major. It wasn't like Mike was some big-time felon dealer or something. Also, Vinoy had no idea what kind of person someone as reclusive as John would consider a friend. Like, what's Mike gonna be like here? But right away, Detective Vinoy felt like Mike was very outgoing and that he wanted to help. Mike said that he and John were close friends, even if they didn't hang out a whole lot. He openly admitted that yes, they both had issues with drugs and made mistakes in the past. But he said John was a really good guy, and he couldn't imagine why anybody would want to hurt him. Vinoy asked Mike if he thought it was possible that John might have fallen deeper into the drug scene than Mike maybe realized. Was it possible he'd gotten in trouble with some dangerous people? But Mike said there was no way. Maybe John still smoked weed, but he was not connected to major drug dealers or anything crazy like that. Vinoy thought Mike came off like he was telling the truth, but he'd been a cop long enough to know that some people were just good liars. So he asked if Mike would be willing to take a polygraph test. And Mike didn't hesitate. He said if that would help, he'd happily do it. Before Vinoy wrapped up their interview and took Mike to go take this polygraph test, He said to Mike that he needed to know if there was anybody else he could think of that John might have been hanging out with around the time he was killed back in January. Mike thought about it for a second, and then he looked up and said, yeah, there were definitely two people the police needed to speak to. A man named Andy Rich, who'd been John's friend for years, and Andy's girlfriend, Sharon Snyder. Mike said the two of them lived far away in Wyoming now, but they had come to visit John back in January, and Mike said he had not seen or heard from John since the two of them had left. In early March, so just a few days after his interview with Mike, Detective Vinoy left the small town of northern Liberty, Iowa, and flew about 1,000 miles away to another small town called Graybull, Wyoming. And after meeting with local police there, Vinoy caught a huge break. Local police were already in the process of securing a search warrant for Andy and his girlfriend's residence, connected to an unrelated drug investigation. So after they got that warrant, which was very quick, Vinoy simply accompanied them when they executed the search on the residence. And as soon as the door opened up, Vinoy got a look at Andy and Sharon, and the first thing he noticed was that they seemed a lot older than John. John was 28, and Andy and Sharon appeared to at least be in their 40s. He could also tell that they were totally panicked by the police being there. As the search was going on, Vinoy pulled Andy and Sharon aside and began speaking to them. And during this conversation, Andy would tell Vinoy that, yes, he and Sharon had driven to Iowa back in January, and that he, Andy, had visited John on his own after dropping Sharon off at another friend's house in a nearby town. Andy said that he and his buddy John just hung out for a little while, and then Andy had left, picked up Sharon, and then the two of them had driven back to Wyoming together. Sharon would reiterate the same story. But the whole time they were talking, what Vinoy really noticed about this couple is that they both seemed incredibly nervous. They couldn't stay still, and they kept darting their eyes away from Vinoy, kind of all around the house, like they were looking for something. And when police finished up their search, Vinoy understood why the couple was so freaked out. Because police found inside of their residence a substantial stash of methamphetamine and marijuana. And, more importantly to Vinoy, they also found bullets for a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber gun used to murder John. The local police began to deal with the drugs they had found. They also bagged up those bullets so they could run some more tests on them to determine if they were the same kind of .22 caliber rounds that had killed John. Detective Vinoy did not have enough evidence yet to try to extradite Andy and Sharon back to Iowa, but he now considered the couple his primary suspects. And just as the police were finishing up inside of the house, a forensics tech came inside and called to Vinoy to come outside and look at something. Vinoy followed the tech outside to Andy and Sharon's car that was parked right out in front, and the tech led him to one of the back windows and pointed to a faint smudge. Vinoy asked what he was looking at, and the tech said that this smudge was clearly a dog's nose print. Vinoy got excited. As strange as it seemed, he felt like this dog's nose print could be the piece of evidence that would solve this case. It could be Keisha's nose print. The tech said he would pull the print and test it to see if it really was Keisha's. And Vinoy felt positive that if the prints were a match, he could prove that either Andy, Sharon, or both of them had driven Keisha on the night of the murder and dropped her off where she was found. And Vinoy was sure whoever had driven Keisha on that night had also killed John. The following day, Detective Vinoy was back in Iowa, feeling confident that his trip to Wyoming would soon pay off in a huge way. But over the next several weeks, as test results started to come in from the crime lab in Wyoming, any excitement he had felt had quickly disappeared. Because the bullets that had been found at Andy and Sharon's place did not match the type of bullets that had killed John. They were the same caliber, but a totally different design. On top of that, the dog's nose print taken from Andy and Sharon's car window was not as complete as they had hoped, so the lab couldn't say one way or the other if it actually matched Keisha's nose. And then also, John's friend Mike had passed his polygraph test. Vinoy knew polygraphs were by no means 100% accurate, but all of a sudden, it was like Vinoy was back to having no clear-cut evidence that pointed to anyone. Vinoy continued to try to track down anybody else who might have been close to John, or who could at least point him in the right direction, but what everybody had already said about John proved to be true. He just wasn't that close to very many people. While Vinoy had hoped John's beloved dog Keisha might be the key to solving this case, he now felt like he had to try going in a totally new direction here. So he decided to focus on the one thing, other than Keisha and his mother, that everybody said John truly loved. And that was his customized Colt 45 Gold Cup pistol. Since John had added his own specific touches to this gun, like the gold screws and the gold accents, Vinoy hoped that would make it easier to track it down, because it was very unique. And so Vinoy reached out to numerous law enforcement agencies, local, state, and federal, along with gun stores and pawn shops all across the country, in the hope that somebody would have spotted this prized gun. But this extensive search came up empty. So Vinoy spent several weeks just kind of retracing his steps all over again. He went back to the crime scene and looked around there, and he also re-interviewed all of his main suspects. He spoke to the guy who had found Keisha. He spoke to Mike in Iowa. And he even returned to Wyoming to speak to Andy and Sharon again. But nothing new developed. Soon, months had passed by without any more evidence, leads, or suspects materializing. And since Detective Vinoy worked in a very small department and he was one of the very few detectives, his time and focus were quickly needed for other investigations. But Vinoy never fully abandoned John's case, and he continued his search for the gold-accented gun. But it just no longer could be his only priority. And over time, despite his efforts, Vinoy began to worry that John's murder might never be solved. Fast forward to late December of 2000, almost 2 years after John's murder. Detective Vinoy sat at his desk working a totally different case. Then Vinoy's phone rang. And when he answered, he heard another detective from another city on the line. At first, Vinoy didn't think much of this. Detectives from different jurisdictions often helped each other if they had cases that might be connected. But as this detective spoke, Vinoy almost couldn't believe what he was hearing. Because the other detective said he had just busted somebody for illegally selling guns, and this gun trafficker, over the course of their interview, had brought up pretty adamantly that they knew about this missing gold Colt 45 gun. Now, this detective didn't really know what they were talking about, but they had looked into it and discovered that Detective Vinoy was in the middle of looking into a murder case that involved a missing gold Colt 45. So he was calling about it. The two detectives spoke for a bit longer about this gun, and then after Vinoy hung up, he felt the type of rush he only felt when he knew he was close to solving a case. The following day, Detective Vinoy and the detective who had called him about this gun sat across from the gun trafficker inside of a cramped interview room in a small police station. Above them, a fluorescent light buzzed and cast a sickly glow over everything. The room just felt tense, and the gun trafficker kept looking back and forth like somebody outside might be watching or listening. But Vinoy and this other detective did their best to keep things as calm as they could, and they explained that any information that led to a murder getting solved would be greatly appreciated by the police and the courts. The gun trafficker nodded. The message was clear. Help the detectives with this murder case and possibly avoid serious jail time for their gun trafficking charges. So, eventually, the gun trafficker gave Vinoy an exact address to visit if he wanted to find this gold Colt 45. And when Vinoy heard this address, he just stared across the table in disbelief. This investigation had started in a little town in Iowa and had already taken him to Wyoming more than once. And now, Detective Vinoy had to pack his bags again and fly down to Dallas, Texas. A few days later, Vinoy and several members of the Dallas Police Department went to the address Vinoy had gotten from the gun trafficker. And there, they met with the man who had supposedly purchased this gold Colt 45 gun. The man was cooperative, but he quickly told them that he actually didn't have the gun anymore. He said he had sold it months ago and had no idea where it was now. After hearing this, Vinoy felt totally defeated, like this trip had been a complete waste of time. But then the man said he actually still had the box that the gold gun had been in when he had bought it. It was a really nice box, so he had kept it for himself. The man went inside and got this box, and when he handed it over, Vinoy looked inside and saw there was a handwritten note. And on this note was a description of the gun that had been sold, and it included all the customizations that had been made to it. And that description absolutely matched John's precious Colt 45. Vinoy thought maybe he could use a handwriting expert to try to prove John had written this note and that the gun that had been sold to this man in Texas was in fact John's gun, But in truth, Vinoy had really hoped that there would be something more definitive here in Texas to connect this gun sale directly to John's killer, whoever it was. And as Vinoy was starting to lose hope that any evidence would come from this trip, he decided to look inside of a small ammunition box that was inside of the actual gun box. And at first, once he looked inside of the small ammo box, it didn't look like there was anything useful inside, just some bullets that may or may not have been used for John's customized gun. But before Vinoy closed the ammunition box, something caught the light, and he stared at it for a second. He waved over another officer, and the two of them just looked at this strange small object in the bottom corner of this small ammo box. Eventually, Vinoy reached in and just lifted up the small ammo box and held it up to the sun to kind of illuminate it with the light. And when he did, he felt like he had just hit a massive jackpot. Because, with this light coming through the box, he could clearly see there was a long strand of white hair tucked inside of this box. And Vinoy felt very confident this hair belonged to a dog. With help from Dallas police, Detective Vinoy collected this piece of hair from the ammunition box and shipped it directly to a woman in California who was one of the few veterinary forensic experts in the country. Using this sample, she was able to run a series of tests, and she determined there was a strong chance that the hair that was found was from the same type of Siberian Husky mix as John's dog, Keisha. As far as Vinoy was concerned, there was no way this was just a big coincidence. So after getting those results, he was sure that whoever had sold the gun to the man in Dallas was the same person who had dropped off Keisha in the neighborhood where she had been found. And armed with this new evidence, Detective Vinoy and his team tracked down the person who had sold the gun in Texas. And after 2 years, they finally knew who had killed John. Based on the dog hair tests, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to John Helbel on the night he was killed, January 20th, 1999. The killer stood just inside of the trailer near the front door. Even inside, they could still feel the cold winter air coming through the thin walls. On the other side of the room, in the flickering light of the TV, they saw John, fast asleep in his recliner, with his beloved dog Keisha curled up at his feet. And John and Keisha were facing the killer. The killer, as slowly as they could, reached down and pulled out a .22 caliber pistol from their waistband. After making sure John and the dog had not woken up, the killer began to walk slowly towards John. But after taking a few steps, the floor underneath the killer began to creak, and the killer froze, worried that John might have woken up. But as he stared at John and the dog, neither moved. They were still sleeping. After taking another steadying breath, the killer continued to move, all the way up to the recliner, and then around to the back, behind John. There, the killer raised their gun, placed it right at the back of John's head, and then fired. Blood rushed out of the small wound as John's head slumped forward and rolled to the side, but the killer fired into the back of John's head one more time, just to be sure he was dead. And John did die, right there in his recliner. The killer began to walk back around the chair, but now Keisha was awake, and she was growling. The killer tried to calm the dog down, but she began barking. And the more the killer tried to keep her quiet, the louder Keisha got. The killer thought about shooting the dog, but they just couldn't bring themselves to do it. Instead, they put the gun back in their waistband, rushed to the kitchen, and grabbed the dog leash that was laying on the counter. The killer then put the leash on Keisha, grabbed John's keys that were nearby, and led the dog out to John's blue van. The killer got Keisha into the van, then climbed into the driver's seat and sped out of the mobile home park. A few minutes later, they turned onto a dimly lit street in a quiet neighborhood. They scanned the road, and it was empty. So the killer climbed out, opened the passenger door, took off Keisha's leash, and let her out into the street. As soon as she was out of the van, the killer got right back in and sped back to John's. Once they got there, the killer rushed inside and dropped the keys on the counter. Then they grabbed a blanket on the floor in the front room and used it to completely cover John's body. Then they turned off the TV. After that, they made their way into the back room and picked up all the boxes that held John's gun collection and carried them all out to their own car. Finally, they ran back into the trailer, locked the door from the inside, and then rushed out, closing the door behind them. The killer got into their car, drove a few miles, picked up their girlfriend, and then began the 1,000-mile drive back to Wyoming. John's friend, Andy Rich, was his killer. Andy had been visiting with John, secretly waiting for the right time to kill him. And on the night of January 20th, once John had dozed off in his recliner, Andy felt that time had come. Andy's motive for killing his friend was he simply wanted John's gun collection. Andy believed he could sell a lot of these guns, especially John's prized gold customized Colt 45, for really good money. So he murdered his friend and robbed him. Detective Vinoy actually suspected Andy and his girlfriend Sharon from the moment he met them in Wyoming. Andy had been at John's residence around the time of the murder. The couple had those .22 caliber bullets in their home, and they had that dog's nose print found on the window of their car. But, of course, none of that evidence actually panned out, and so Vinoy had nothing tying either of them directly to the murder. But all of that changed almost 2 years later when Vinoy received that call about the gun trafficker who'd gotten busted for selling guns. It would turn out the detective who had called Vinoy was in Wyoming, and the gun trafficker was Andy's girlfriend Sharon, and Sharon was finally ready to come clean. Vinoy went back to Wyoming to interview Sharon, and she would tell him that she had lied to him during the initial investigation because she was terrified of her boyfriend Andy. She claimed she had no idea that John was dead when Andy had picked her up at her friend's house in Iowa and they had driven back to Wyoming. But she now admitted that soon after they had gotten home from that trip, Andy told her he was now magically in possession of John's favorite gun, the gold Colt 45, and that also Andy was going to be driving down to Texas to meet with a buyer who wanted to buy this gun. And he told Sharon exactly where this buyer lived. By the time Detective Vinoy visited Dallas to go speak to this buyer, he was sure Andy was the murderer. He just needed proof to bolster his case. And that proof came from the dog hair that was found inside of the ammunition box inside of the gun case. Now, Vinoy never actually found John's prized golden gun, but he did have that handwritten note that had been found inside of the gun box. And a handwriting expert would confirm that the writing matched John's. And so, with Sharon's story and the evidence Vinoy found in Texas, he went back to Wyoming and he confronted Andy. And Andy eventually confessed to the murder, simply saying, "I shot John and took his guns." The weapons charges against Sharon got dropped, and she was only given probation for the drugs found inside of her home. Sharon said she was glad that Andy left Keisha alive, but she never actually understood why he'd done it. She said he'd hated that dog, but for some reason, he just couldn't bring himself to harm her. And so it was that decision that ultimately connected him to the murder. After his confession, Andy took a plea deal and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. He was released on parole in 2020. Ever since he was a child, Mark Twitchell had always dreamed of becoming a big-time Hollywood filmmaker. But he knew the odds were stacked against him because he lived in Edmonton, Canada, which was not exactly known for being a movie-making hub. Nonetheless, after high school, he enrolled in an Edmonton art college, and in 2000, he graduated, earning his degree in radio and television art. But after college, despite utilizing his training to make several films, none of them generated any buzz beyond his friends and family, and so it seemed like his filmmaking career was turning into a bit of a dud. However, in 2007, Mark had a bit of an unintentional breakthrough. He had been a longtime Star Wars fanatic, and that year, he decided, purely as a passion project, he was going to write a script for a prequel to the Star Wars franchise. When he finished it and shared the script with some of his colleagues, they were so impressed with his writing, they said, "Mark, you need to produce this into a movie. This is incredible." And so Mark, who was totally amazed at this unbelievable feedback he was getting, decided, you know what? What the heck? I will produce this movie. And so he began sending his script out to different actors and actresses to see if they might be interested in playing a role. And amazingly, one of the original Star Wars actors, Jeremy Bulloch, who played Boba Fett, he read the script and he was so impressed by it that he agreed to play a role in Mark's film. And so this passion project had quickly turned into Mark's biggest success yet. When the movie was finished, it did well, but it didn't propel Mark into Hollywood stardom. However, it did put him on the map as a bona fide filmmaker, and it showed him that if he just focused on making films about subjects he was already very passionate about, those films would be much more likely to succeed. And so in 2008, so roughly a year after creating the Star Wars fan fiction film, Mark decided to embark on another film project around another passion of his, Dexter. Dexter was a very popular TV show about a fictional serial killer whose name was Dexter, and the way Dexter would kill his victims is he would lure them into these small rooms, which he called kill rooms, and inside of them, basically every surface, the ceiling, the walls, the floor, were all covered in plastic sheeting to catch any of the blood, and then he would kill his victims, usually with a knife, and then afterwards he would dismember them and bag up their body, and he would roll up all this plastic, kind of collecting all the evidence, and then he would dump the plastic and the body into the ocean. Mark was obsessed with the show, and so it inspired him to make his next movie be about a killer too. Except instead of it being fiction like Dexter, he wanted his movie to be at least based on real events. And it just so happened, at the time he was thinking about doing this movie, there was this uncaught murderer terrorizing Edmonton, and so Mark decided the Edmonton killer would be his star. Mark would spend the next several weeks obsessively researching the Edmonton killer and his victims and establishing a clear timeline of what had happened with this case, and then after he felt like he had compiled every piece of information he possibly could, he used that research to concoct a 42-page first draft of his script. And as soon as he was done with that first draft, it somehow got leaked. And when it got leaked, the contents of this script were so shocking and so controversial that the script wound up in the hands of the Edmonton police. And when they read the script, they immediately recognized they had a big problem. They reached out to Mark and they told him under no circumstances can you turn this script into a movie, and then the police basically wiped this script off the face of the earth. Today, if you go looking for Mark's script online, you'll basically only find heavily censored versions of it. But recently, I got my hands on an uncensored version of this 42-page script. Now, I'm not going to literally read you this script. However, what I'm going to do is use the script's information to tell you Mark's highly controversial Edmonton killer story. As you listen, remember this story is based on actual events. And so the victims' names and the information about them is real. Okay, here we go. In early October 2008, a soft-spoken 26-year-old casino security guard named Giles Tetreault was living alone in Edmonton. Giles's life had recently been turned upside down because a few months earlier, his wife had told him that she just didn't love him anymore and that she was going to leave him. Giles was still very much in love with his wife, and so this was a totally heartbreaking experience for him. After she left, Giles tried to stay busy and keep his mind occupied, but it rarely worked. Oftentimes, he felt crushingly lonely and sad. But on Friday, October 3rd, when Giles came home from work that afternoon, he suddenly felt like, you know what, I gotta get my life together, and I'm gonna start by finding myself a new romantic partner. And so he went on a dating site and he made himself a profile and he began scrolling through all of the women's profiles that lived roughly in his area. And at first, no one really appealed to him, but then he stopped on this one woman's profile. She was this young, blonde, beautiful woman named Sheena, and she lived right in Edmonton. And so Giles thought, what the heck, I'll send her a message. And so he did, just introducing himself and asking to talk further. And she responded just a couple of minutes later. And then over the next couple of hours, the two exchanged dozens of messages, getting to know each other. And then finally, Sheena just says to Giles, hey, we live so close together. Why don't we get together tonight and go grab dinner and watch a movie together? And Giles is thrilled and he says, yeah, I'll come pick you up. What's your address? And Sheena would tell him, you know what? I don't feel comfortable sharing my address over this dating website. And so instead, she sent Giles this strange customized set of directions that didn't give the actual address of her house. Instead, it basically gave Giles a set of known landmarks in Edmonton that he could follow until he finally arrived at her residence. And she also told him that when he arrived, instead of just coming up to her house, there would be a detached garage and the door would be open and he would go through the garage, out the door into her backyard, and then he would go up the back steps to the back door of her house and she would meet him there. Now, Giles did think this was a little bit strange, but at the same time he's thinking, I am basically a complete stranger to her. We just met today on the internet, and so I really can't blame her for taking some extra safety precautions with me. And so he told Sheena he had no issues using her special directions, and then he said he'd be over soon. And so Giles hopped in the shower, he freshened up, he got dressed, he hopped in his truck, and then he began driving to Sheena's house. After about 15 minutes of following these directions, he reached the end of them, and they placed him in this alleyway in a suburban neighborhood. And where he stopped, he looked off to his right and he saw there was this 2-car garage, and he knew it was Sheena's garage because one of the doors was open like she said it would be, although the door was not open all the way. It was open enough to where he would have to duck to get into the garage, but either way, he knew it was her garage. And so he turns off his truck and he gets out and he tries to look up at Sheena's house behind the garage to see if maybe he can see her looking out the back door. But the detached garage that was right up against the street was kind of blocking his view. And so he thought, okay, whatever, I'll just go in and make my way up to the back steps. And so he walks over to this 2-car garage and he goes to the open side. He ducks down and he goes underneath and he stands up inside of the garage. Now, it was dark inside of the garage, there was no light on, but there was enough light spilling in from the opening of the garage door that he could see there was really nothing in the garage. However, virtually every surface, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, was covered in plastic sheeting. Now, he had no idea what this plastic sheeting was for, and he really didn't care. He just kept walking across the garage towards the door that would lead into Sheena's backyard. And when he reached that door, he reached down to the door handle and he was about to turn it when he felt a blinding pain in the back of his neck. He whipped around, and even though it was dark inside of this garage, he could clearly see this huge man in a black and gold hockey mask standing right in front of him, holding a stun baton. Giles tries to run past him to try to get out of the garage, but the man grabs him and then takes his stun baton and drives it into Giles' stomach, and he pulls the trigger. Immediately, Giles feels this coursing pain in his torso, and he falls to the ground, and then this man in the mask releases the trigger, and Giles tries to scramble up to his feet to try to run out of the garage, but as soon as Giles turns around, he stops where he is because he sees this huge guy in the mask is standing between him and this open garage door, and he's now holding a gun in his hand and he's aiming it right at Giles. And so Giles freezes. He has no idea what's going on, and this man who's got this mask on barks at Giles to get on the ground and put your face on the ground. And so Giles at this point is thinking, I'm going to get killed in here. I have nothing I can do. I'm completely defenseless here. And so he just does what he's told. And he lies down on the plastic sheeting and he's totally terrified. And this man walks over and he puts a piece of duct tape over Giles's eyes. And so as he's laying there blind and terrified, Giles becomes very emotional. He suddenly longs for his ex-wife and for his family and his friends. He wishes he could see them just one more time, and he knows he's not going to. Then as he's laying there, he's coming to the stark realization that he didn't tell anyone where he was going. And so if this masked maniac does kill him, who's going to find his body? Will his family and friends ever know what happened to him? So as he's laying there thinking of these horrible thoughts, he hears his attacker, who's several feet behind him, start fiddling with what sounds like chains or handcuffs. And Giles thinks to himself, if I get chained up in here, I really am done. And so he has this sudden surge of adrenaline where he thinks to himself, I'm going to get killed in here. I know it. I'm going to get killed. But if I'm going to die, I'm going to die on my terms. And so Giles takes a deep breath and then jumps to his feet, rips the tape off of his eyes. He turns around and he faces his attacker and he says, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to go out this way. And the attacker is totally surprised, but he just begins to raise his gun at Giles to shoot him. And Giles lunges forward and he grabs the barrel of the gun and he pushes it away from him. And as soon as he does that, Giles realizes something. The gun is made of plastic. It's fake. And so Giles is suddenly so confident, he grabs the arms of his attacker and he tries to kick the guy in the legs, but the attacker is so much bigger and stronger than Giles that he just headbutts Giles. Giles goes flying to the ground and his attacker jumps on top of him and begins punching him and slamming his skull into the ground. But Giles is so high on adrenaline, he can't feel any of the blows. All he's trying to do this whole time as he's getting pummeled is just find a way to stand up and run out of this garage. Just get out, escape. And amazingly, against all odds, he does manage in between blows to wriggle his way out of the attacker's grasp. But as he begins to run towards that opening in the garage door, the attacker grabs him by the jacket. And so Giles twists himself and he actually comes out of the jacket. And then he throws himself onto the ground and he rolls out of the garage. And as soon as he is free, he suddenly can't stand up. The stun baton, he didn't feel it before, but it had sapped all of his strength. But the adrenaline had kind of overridden that feeling. But here he is outside and he suddenly can't stand up. And so he's trying to stand up. And then the attacker, who's still inside, dives down, reaches out from underneath the garage and grabs Giles by the ankle and begins trying to pull him back into the garage. And so Giles is kicking and screaming and punching, and he finally breaks free. And then he has another surge of adrenaline, and he stands up and just begins running down the alleyway. Doesn't even go to his car. He just starts running towards, hopefully, civilization. And he makes it a couple of houses before he collapses to the ground in this very busy walking trail. And so he's landed right in this intersection where he's hoping someone's going to be. He turns back and looks down the alleyway, and he sees his attacker, who's now on the road. He's got the mask still on his face, and he's charging up the road. Giles can't even get up. He's so tired, but Giles looks to his side and he sees there's this random couple walking down the walking path. They see Giles on the ground who's calling out for help, and they run over to him and they get right in front of Giles, and Giles immediately points at the attacker coming down the alleyway and says, "He's trying to kill me." And the attacker, amazingly, just jogs right up to Giles, right up to the couple. He does not take his mask off, and he acts like he's friends with Giles and says, "Oh, come on, Frank, you're making a big deal out of it. It's a game. Come back to the garage. I'll meet you there." And then the attacker just turns around and walks back down the alleyway back towards his garage. And so Giles turns and looks up at the couple, who are totally freaked out by this whole situation. They don't know if this is some weird setup that they're going to get robbed or something. They don't know if this is a hoax. And so they say, "Hey, you're on your own, pal." And they turn and they leave. And so Giles is left in the middle of this intersection. The only people that could have helped him are now gone. And so he rolls over and just looks down the alleyway in the direction of the garage. And he can actually see his attacker pacing back and forth inside of the garage because that door is partially open. And so Giles doesn't know what to do. He has to get to his truck to get out of here. And so he just sits there for a couple of seconds, just watching the attacker, making sure he's staying inside of the garage. And then finally, he just took a deep breath. He pulled himself up and he stumbled down the alleyway. He got in his truck, fired it up, and he peeled out of there. When Giles got home, he was obviously traumatized from this horrible thing that had just happened to him, but he also felt embarrassed and kind of ashamed that he had clearly just gotten catfished by the psycho in the garage. Obviously, Sheena, the woman he supposedly was talking to, was not real. It was that guy in the garage that had attacked him, but he didn't really understand why it had happened. He had no idea why anyone would target him, and so the whole situation was just such a mess. He decided, you know what, I'm not going to tell anyone. He didn't report it to the police, he didn't tell his friends, he didn't tell his family, he just decided he was going to move on and forget about it. A week later, on October 8th, another Edmonton man, 38-year-old Johnny Altinger, was perusing the dating website that Giles had been using. Johnny made a living doing quality control for an oil and gas company, but he hated that job. He much preferred to spend his time tinkering with his computers or his prized motorcycle. Johnny had lots of very close friends, but romance was always something that had eluded him. So that afternoon, Johnny, like Giles, was on this dating website to potentially find a romantic partner. And so as he was scrolling through all of these different women's profiles that lived roughly in his area, he wasn't interested in any of them until he stopped on this one profile of this beautiful young blonde woman named Jen, who lived right in Edmonton. And so Johnny was interested. He sent her a message, and very quickly she wrote back, and before long the two are chumming it up, and then eventually they actually agree to get together that night for dinner and a movie. But when Johnny asked Jen for her address, she would tell him that she's a paranoid person and she doesn't want to give him her actual address over this website, and so instead she gave him a set of very strange directions that relied on local landmarks in Edmonton to guide him into her residence. And she would tell Johnny, when you get here, go through the garage, the door will be open, go out the back door, go into the backyard, make your way up to the back of the house, and I will meet you at the back door. And so Johnny definitely thought these directions were very strange, but he was really eager to meet up with Jen, and so he really didn't care. And so he told Jen it was no big deal, he'd happily follow her directions, and then he hopped in the shower and he got himself together, and then before he left to go to Jen's house, he forwarded Jen's email that included her very strange directions. He sent those directions to one of his very close friends, and he kind of jokingly included a message that was like, "Hey, if I go missing tonight, this is where I'm going." And then Johnny hopped in his car and he left. The directions brought Johnny to the same garage in the same alleyway that Giles had been to a week earlier. And when Johnny came to a stop in front of Jen's 2-car garage with one of the doors partially open, he saw there were lights still on inside of the garage, and he saw someone walking around inside. And so Johnny looked at his watch and he realized he was maybe 15 or 20 minutes too early. And so he parks his car and he's thinking, okay, Jen might be inside of this garage and I'm early, but maybe I'll just walk over and say hi to her. I'm sure she wouldn't mind. And so Johnny turns off his car, he gets out, and he starts walking over to this half-open garage door. And as he gets closer and closer, the lights in the garage go off. And so Johnny stops and he's thinking, why are the lights off? Did she hear me? Does she not want me to come in? What's going on? But he's thinking, okay, well, I should definitely go over and say something. And so he walks over to this open garage door and he bends down and he looks inside and it's totally dark. And he just says, hello? And there's a pause, and then the lights come on, and Johnny suddenly sees this garage that's basically devoid of anything, minus a table off to the side, and every surface is covered in plastic sheeting. The floors, the walls, the ceiling, everything. And in the back of the garage is not Jen. Instead, it's this man he doesn't recognize. And so Johnny's looking at this man, and this man is looking over at Johnny, and finally the man speaks and says, hi, I'm Harry. I'm a designer. I rent this garage out from Jen, and I just talked to Jen, and you're meeting up with her tonight, right? You're meeting up with Jen? Yeah, she's running late, so I think she'll be back in about maybe 20 minutes, so can you come back in 20 minutes, come right back here, come to the garage, and I'll bring you up to the house, because I know you're meeting her up at the house, so 20 minutes. And so Johnny doesn't really know what to make of this. He figures, okay, I don't really know what Jen's arrangement is with this designer in this plastic-covered garage, but, whatever. And so Johnny says, okay, no problem. I'll come back in 20 minutes. And so Johnny turns around and he walks back to his car and he leaves and drives around for about 20 minutes. And then he comes back to the garage. And as soon as he parks, he notices right away the light in the garage is now off. So presumably Harry has actually left. And so he will not be available to walk Johnny up to the house to meet Jen. But Johnny was thinking, I don't really want to interact with Harry. He seems like a strange guy anyways. And so he counts this as a win. And so Johnny parks his car, he hops out, he walks over to the garage, he bends down and goes inside of the garage. He stands up and he walks across the plastic-lined floor to the door that's going to lead out into Jen's backyard. But before he reaches that door, something smashes into the back of his head. And immediately Johnny is horribly dazed and he instinctively throws his hands up to protect his head. And he begins spinning around trying to figure out who or what had just hit him. And as soon as he turns around, he sees in the shadows is the figure of none other than the man he saw before, Harry. And Harry is holding a big metal pipe. And immediately when Johnny sees him, he begins screaming, police, police, police. And Harry just winds up and wails on Johnny with this metal pipe. And Johnny's trying to turn around and get away from Harry, but Harry just keeps moving around him and beating him with this pipe until finally Johnny collapses on the ground, but he's not unconscious. And so Johnny is kind of shielding his head and he's looking up at Harry, who's now just standing over him. He's ceased his initial barrage. And Johnny begins pleading with Harry, I'll give you money, I'll give you anything, just please let me go. And so Harry smiles and he says, you promise you won't tell anyone if I let you go? But before Johnny could answer this, Harry winds up with his pipe and he brings it crashing down on Johnny's face. But amazingly, this does not knock Johnny unconscious. Instead, Johnny grabs the pipe after it hits him in the head and he holds onto it to prevent Harry from hitting him again. And so at this point, Harry is frustrated that Johnny is still putting up this huge fight. And so with one hand holding onto this pipe that Johnny has the other end of, Harry reaches down with his other hand and he unsheaths a hunting knife. And he holds the blade right in front of Johnny's face. And as soon as Johnny sees this knife, his eyes go wide and he lets go of the pipe and he begins to plead for his life. But Harry just smiles and continues to show him the blade. And then at some point, he grabs Johnny's shoulder, he pulls the knife back, and he plunges it into Johnny's stomach. Johnny howls out in pain and he curls over and he begins screaming for the police, screaming for someone to help him. And then finally, Harry pulls the knife out of his stomach and then plunges it into the side of Johnny's neck. And then Harry lets go of the knife and he stands up and he just watches Johnny as he bleeds out onto the plastic lining. As Harry watched Johnny die, he had this pang of regret. He thought to himself, why didn't I play more mind games with him before I killed him? I'll do that with the next one. After Johnny died, Harry would dismember and bag up Johnny's body, and then he would roll up all of the plastic from the walls and the ceiling. He'd gather that all up, and then a couple of days later, he would dump both Johnny's body parts and all of the plastic containing all of the evidence down a nearby sewer drain. At this point in the story, Mark's script just kind of comes to an abrupt end. We don't know what Harry did after getting rid of Johnny's body and the evidence because Mark just didn't write it. It was like he didn't finish the script. And there's a reason for that, and it's the same reason the police stepped in and stopped Mark from making this script into a movie. At the time they read his script, the police had already figured out who owned the garage where Giles and Johnny were attacked. Johnny's friend, the one who Johnny had forwarded Jen's email that had those strange directions, well, that friend gave those directions to the police once Johnny had been reported missing. And so the police followed these strange directions to this garage, and they discovered it was not owned by some young, beautiful blonde named Jen or Sheena. It was not owned by some designer named Harry. It was owned by a young, up-and-coming filmmaker named Mark Twitchell. But to this point, Mark had been extremely cooperative with police and allowed them to search it, and they found nothing. And he explained to them he was not remotely the only person with access to this garage, not by a long shot. But when police searched Mark's laptop, they found a hidden document, and this document was his 42-page script. And when they read it, they saw there was a huge issue. Giles, the first victim of the Edmonton killer, had eventually gotten over his embarrassment and shame, and he went to the Edmonton police and he told them in detail what happened to him inside of that garage. But Giles was so scared he had not told anybody else what had happened. The only people who knew were himself and the Edmonton police. Yet somehow, in Mark's script, the account of what happened to Giles was exactly correct. Every little detail of what happened to Giles was encompassed inside of the script. And the reason Mark had this information is because Mark was in the garage when Giles got attacked. Because Mark was the Edmonton killer. Mark had been so desperate to make his killer in his new movie as good as Dexter in the TV show that Mark decided he needed to literally become Dexter in real life. He needed to know exactly what it felt like to lure an unsuspecting victim into a kill room and murder them so that he'd be able to more accurately write about it in his script. He believed this would put his movie over the top. It would be the most authentic killer movie ever, and it would be his ticket to Hollywood. And so after Mark used a fake dating profile to trap and then attack Giles, after that experience, he wrote about it, and that became his script. And then when he did the same thing to Johnny and then actually successfully killed and disposed of him, he sat down and wrote about that experience too and tacked it onto the end of the Giles attack. He was literally living his movie and writing the script in real time. The title that Mark gave his script was SK Confessions, which stood for Serial Killer Confessions. And that's exactly what the script was. It was a real confession. And based on the way his script just kind of abruptly ends without any sort of conclusion, it seems fairly obvious that Mark was planning to kill more people and then incorporate those experiences into this script. Ultimately, though, the script that was found by police was used to convict Mark. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak in to the 5-star review button's house and replace all of the lids of their Tupperware with off-market brands, so none of them fit. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with